Hello and welcome back to SAMexpert TV. On our channel, on our channels, and our live events, we often talk about Microsoft SPLA in the context of compliance audits. But audits may or may not happen. Life goes on. And when you're a service provider, your true priority is probably not audits, almost 100% not audits. It's all about growing your business and making a profit, isn't it? So today I'd like to talk exactly about that, about how to combine the traditional Microsoft SPLA licensing with relatively modern offerings like CSP-Hosting and SQL Server with Azure Arc. Because, well, as much as Microsoft is trying to present this as easy to understand and implement, they often not. And providers have to deal with a lot of confusion already. There's SPLA, there's bring your own license, there's flexible virtualization benefit, there's the legacy bring your own license via license mobility. Is it still alive? Do we still need to take care of it? And now we have CSP hosting almost for 3 years, but it still causes confusion due to various reasons. I don't want to talk about it yet. And all this mixing SPLA and CSP hosting, bring your own license, and now SQL with Azure Arc. It's a big deal. It must be done carefully. It must be done with planning and preparation. And if you have a good planning and preparation, if you understand at least the high-level concepts, which I'll try to cover today, then you're truly profitable, and you can avoid nasty surprises in an audit. My name is Alexander Golyev, as you can see below here. I'm the services lead in SAMexpert, and in my career, I have worked with over 100 service providers of different kinds, flavors, and sizes, and all over the world, defending them in audits mostly, and helping them improve their compliance and commercial operations, and avoiding wasting hundreds of millions, literally hundreds of millions of dollars in license fees and audit penalties. And I want to begin with the usual elephant in the room. This is the most frequently asked questions that we get from service providers. What is happening with Microsoft SPLA? Is it being discontinued? Can we still rely on it? There are two sides to it. About a year ago, Microsoft made a written promise to CSP to keep SPLA for at least 5 more years. Was it actually 2 years ago? Yeah, roughly a year ago. On the other hand, they also promised to CSP, the Association of European Cloud Providers, to release a new product based on Azure Local, as it's currently known, specifically for service providers. And that hasn't yet happened. They missed 2 deadlines without any real consequences, which kind of puts the promise to keep SPLA for another 5 years under a big question mark. But is it really big? I don't think so. In our opinion, at SAMexpert, SPLA is safe for the time being. It's not like Microsoft currently has a choice to just abruptly end SPLA without offering an almost one-to-one alternative and wrecking the entire provider ecosystem. They don't have a one-to-one replacement. But they're making the moves to undermine SPLA. I say undermine, replace SPLA with something, with other alternative licensing solutions that benefit Microsoft in the first place. However, I wouldn't say that these alternatives are always bad for service providers. That would be wrong. It would be incorrect. There are benefits for service providers. There are benefits for end clients. I wouldn't ask you to jump straight into these new offerings. You need to assess it carefully. We'll talk about it today. And whether they are beneficial for you and for your own clients, it really depends on your business model and your service portfolio. I will remind you, this is a live event. I obviously have a script I follow. There's something I want to talk about. I have bullet points. I have main ideas in my head and on paper here on my table. Again, this is a live event. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. These are confusing subjects. They're not easy. If you think they're easy, you don't see the whole picture. And I'm happy today and after that to clarify those uncertainties and help you make sense of it all. So for some of you, CSP hosting may be exactly what you have been missing in SPLA. For other providers, it may be an entirely wrong program, and it's fine. For some of you, SQL Server with Azure Arc may bring additional revenue. For others, SPLA would still be a much better choice. And this is exactly what I wanted to discuss today: CSP hosting and SQL Server with Azure Arc in the provider's environment, along with everything connected, like bring your own license and flexible virtualization benefit. We can't talk CSP hosting without mentioning flexible virtualization benefit. We'll get to that. Again, if something is not clear, please use chat. And I will begin with SQL Server with Azure Arc. And the reason why I want to start with SQL Server with Azure Arc is because it's the most recent and, at the moment, a truly flagship scorecard offering from Microsoft. You shouldn't ignore it. Their salespeople are handsomely rewarded for selling it, including to service providers, which means if it benefits you, it benefits Microsoft, it benefits Microsoft salespeople. You see what I'm leading to. So what is it, SQL Server with Azure Arc? Microsoft Azure Arc for SQL Server allows connecting any SQL Server, and we have providers who have successfully connected SQL servers back to 2008. It connects them to Microsoft Azure, regardless of where SQL Server runs. It can be run on-premises, within a service provider's environment, shared or dedicated, and even in, I don't know, AWS, for example. To enable it, you run a script that installs an Azure Arc agent, which connects the SQL service to Azure. Simple. And actually, it's not a difficult thing to do. And end clients that did that benefit from centralized management and monitoring capabilities built in Azure Arc. It's actually pretty nice, almost like a flight dashboard with all your SQLs, and you can manage them. You can see their live signs, heartbeats, and problems with them. It's a good feature. And also, there's another feature. There's another benefit to that, to using Azure Arc, which is, from the licensing point of view, you don't need a license anymore in a traditional sense. You don't need a SPLA license anymore in a traditional sense. It becomes an Azure expense. It enables hourly billing for SQL Server. The licensed end user organization only pays for the time SQL is running. If it's shut down, there's no fee. And they pay for it via their Azure subscription. And you probably have noted already. If you didn't, I will draw your attention to that. I said end clients multiple times already, not providers. We need to talk about it. We need to seriously talk about it. The way the licensing documentation around SQL Server with Azure Arc is currently written for providers and for end clients, SQL Server with Azure Arc is an end client's benefit. They can bring it to their provider's estate, shared or dedicated. There are almost no limitations, but it's still billable according to the documentation via the end client's Azure subscription. We can call it bring your own license, or I just invented a new term today, bring your own Azure. That's what it is. There's only one officially permitted exception when, as a provider, you can use SQL Server with Azure Arc. And that is when you use SQL to support your own SaaS applications. If you are a software as a services provider, if you have your own, say, accounting system or something else that you developed, hotel booking system, then in that case, you may use SQL with Azure Arc, underpinning your infrastructure, and you can pay for it through Azure. using Azure Arc if you want to. It still makes sense. And this is where it gets very, very interesting. I have recently spoken to a few prominent Microsoft licensing experts. You all know them. I just don't want to name them today. But there are more licensing experts than just me, funny enough. And none of them, could recall anything about allowing providers to pay for SQL Server with Azure Arc via their own subscriptions, but provide them to end clients as SQL Server instances. So that is not officially granted. And here is something that you probably haven't heard, and I'm going to say it today for the first time. It's not confirmed. There are rumors. I would say it makes sense to pay attention to them, but I will not confirm them for various reasons. I will not confirm that. I will stick with that. That's a rumor. That Microsoft approached some of the providers with an offer to replace SQL Server licensed in SPLA with SQL Server, licensed with Azure Arc, and here's the cherry on the cake, and paid for via the providers Azure subscription. See where I'm going to? It's a much better configuration for a service provider. That's what service providers probably want instead of fiddling with end clients' subscriptions. If this unconfirmed rumor just triggered your interest, I suggest you reach out to your Microsoft or CSP channel contacts and ask them whether that offer is officially on the table for you. Tell them that you're seriously considering the move from SPLA to Azure Arc, but you want the billing to go via your Azure subscription. I'm not saying tenant, that's subscription. If you do so, and they say, oh, actually, yeah, it's an interesting proposition, I can't emphasize this enough. Get the confirmation in writing. Again, get that confirmation that you may do so in writing, because until it's clearly and unambiguously, I pronounced it correctly, unambiguously, in the official documentation from Microsoft, it's not a compliance scheme. So every exception, which may be granted, must have supporting evidence in writing. If the person you're talking to, you can see that they express excitement anyhow, then don't forget to negotiate a good deal. At the moment, they are handsomely rewarded for SQL with Azure Arc. And we can help you with that. By the way, we have a dedicated team and SAMexpert that handles commercial negotiations with Microsoft. So you know where to find us. But let's get back to the officially allowed use when it's paid for via the end user subscription. What if the only option is that? What if the only option is for your end clients to pay for SQL with Azure Arc hosted in your data centers via their own Azure subscriptions? How is that good for you as a service provider? The reality is the vast majority of service providers, with just a few exceptions, usually large infrastructure as a service providers, are anyhow Microsoft CSPs, selling licenses. Some are even tier one direct CSPs. And if you are one of those, the benefits should be obvious to you. If you resell Azure Azure to your end clients, you get your regular Azure kickbacks and margins and other bells and whistles and cookies, biscuits from Microsoft. So plus you make your Microsoft reps, as I said already multiple times, and Microsoft as a company happy. And there are multiple ways to extract additional partner benefits from Microsoft when you keep them happy. Plus, you get a competitive offering because SQL with Azure Arc is billed per hour as opposed to SPLA. SPLA is billed per month. Plus, as it stands right now, SQL with Azure Arc may be cheaper than SPLA. Last time I checked, it was cheaper in every region, especially in the United States. And therefore, you can offer your clients a cheaper and more flexible SQL Server option. This is perhaps the most flexible SQL Server option right now. And in addition, if you manage SQL instances for your own clients, you get the management features of Azure Arc as a bonus. I just spoke to a provider last week who was absolutely just elated that they can now see every single SQL in their estate, in the hosting estate, because they not just host virtual machines, they also manage them for their clients. It's a fantastic feature from their point of view. It's like a control center capabilities. So by all means. An important note. If what I just said sounds like an advertisement for Microsoft, please let me remind you that we are not Microsoft partners. We're not, SAMexpert is not Microsoft partner. We deliberately don't sell any of the Microsoft stuff. I don't endorse them in any way. My only role today in this life is to try and clarify the new licensing options available to you as a provider, and Azure Arc is just one of them. So, do your homework. Listen to me, read other sources, Google, ask ChatGPT, or whichever else AI you use now instead of Google, but be careful with its answers, check all the sources. Do your homework, assess all aspects of introducing SQL with Azure Arc, whether that's good or bad for you, because you maybe, for example, the way back to SPLA will be a bit difficult. And if it's not for you, it's not for you. Please also, it happened last week, don't confuse SQL Server with Azure Arc and a similar licensing option called Windows Server with Azure Arc. The latter, Windows Server with Azure Arc, isn't yet in any shape or form allowed to be used in service provider data centers. So, just to summarize the first part, SQL Server with Azure Arc gives end clients more flexibility and potentially it makes your services more competitive. But please don't think of Azure Arc as a full replacement for SPLA. This is what Microsoft is trying to do. They're trying to introduce new options to replace SPLA, and Azure Arc is a good option. It's still an option. SPLA is still available. There's no need to transition completely to SQL with Azure Arc. It's just simply another option to consider, another offering to add to your portfolio. And from that perspective, it is a positive evolution. Honestly, I like criticizing Microsoft. I can't find anything bad in this option, except that the billing is through Azure and Microsoft has more visibility, so just consider that. A side note, which may be very important from the infrastructure redesign point of view, switching to SQL Server with Azure Arc can be done in place. Unlike other things that I'll talk about a bit later, just following this part, you don't need to do anything. You don't need to change your infrastructure, move the service anywhere, create dedicated clusters. You install an agent, you connect it to Azure, you stop paying via SPLA, you start paying via Azure. That's it. That's it. Which is not the case with the other, I would say relatively new, it's already 3 years old, licensing option, which is called CSP-Hosting. It's another option for service providers. And it's been around, as I said, for nearly 3 years and still remains largely misunderstood. That I don't want to go into why. We have a video on this channel where I explain why I think it's misunderstood, why I think it's missold. So just let me tell you a story to clarify what it is. Let's keep it simple today. It's a difficult topic anyway. So in October 2022, almost 3 years ago, Microsoft introduced the flexible virtualization benefit. Not yet. Let's not talk about CSP hosting yet. Flexible virtualization benefit. It's most flexible and exhaustive bring your own license model for the end clients, which providers may benefit from. And flexible virtualization benefit in the whole history of Microsoft was probably the biggest improvement for the end clients. However, providers like you can still benefit from it as it gives your end clients more flexibility. And if you understand how to combine it with SPLA, and also if you sell licenses, you can improve your offerings. And as I said, if you actively sell Microsoft CSP, then, well, it gives you additional business opportunities, selling licenses, earning money, earning benefits from Microsoft, and so on and so forth. And the way flexible virtualization benefit works is an end client, it's very simple. An end client may bring any license on a subscription model or any license with active software assurance, which is also a subscription, to any service provider with the exception of Amazon, Google, and Alibaba, and deploy that license in a dedicated environment and in a shared cloud environment. And yes, there was a different licensing program called License Mobility with Software Assurance, but that one had limitations. There was only a limited subset of products. Here, any product may be brought in to a service provider infrastructure, any license, not any product, any license for any product, there are no limitations. Just make sure that the license is on an active subscription of a sort. There are no specific authorizations also for the service providers. So again, if you are not Google, Amazon, Alibaba, or in Azure, by all means, you can benefit from it. If you're still not, after 3 years, where have you been? So if you're still struggling, reach out to me, ask questions. I don't bite. The exception that it doesn't work on Google, Amazon, Alibaba, or Azure is important, because if you use these hyperscalers servers in your services to provide services to your end client, then you can't use flexible virtualization benefit on those servers. You can't. Google partners can't do that. Amazon partners can't do that, unfortunately. But if it's your data center or any other, say, hyperscaler like Oracle or Kyndryl, by all means, you can do that. Now, here is something critically important. They may contradict what you may have been told. CSP-Hosting, which is a program for service providers, is just an extension of the flexible virtualization benefit. It gives participating providers a few additional benefits on top of the flexible virtualization benefit. Excuse me for repeating the word benefit. Most providers that we work with in Europe and in the United States don't need to become CSP hosters. So what are those benefits? What are those additional biscuits, as I call them? Most importantly, participating in the CSP hoster program allows providers to pre-activate virtual machines. So if you have like a virtual machine marketplace or image library, then you're allowed to activate them with your own keys that you get through, it used to be Volume License Service Center, now through the Microsoft 365 portal. Doesn't matter. You're allowed as a provider, being a CSP hoster, to pre-activate those virtual machines and just deploy them activated. Non-CSP hosters may still deploy, say, Windows 11 virtual machines, but then the end clients must activate them with their keys, or you may activate them on their behalf, which is an additional step in the process. It slows down the deployment, but is it really mission critical for you? If it is, then probably think about being a CSP hoster. If it's not mission critical, you don't need to become a CSP hoster. You may still benefit from the majority of other bring your own license things. Secondly, there are a couple of licensing benefits only available to end clients of CSP hosters, not just every provider. And those both benefits relate to Windows Server. If you want to know more about those benefits, please let me know in the chat. Otherwise, there are articles on our website, SAMexpert.com. And there are dedicated videos actually on this channel. So both on LinkedIn, but if you want to find videos, it's easier to use YouTube. We have a YouTube channel called SAMexpert TV. So if you're watching us on LinkedIn, we have a YouTube channel. Find us there. And just find that information there. Read about it. We have articles comparing Spline CSP hosting, quite a few of them right, actually. And here is the most important difference, which you just need to grasp, between SPLA and CSP hosting and bring your own license in general. In SPLA, the provider is the licensee. The license is granted to you as a provider. It's not sold to the end client. You actually can't. You're not allowed to resell the license to the end client. You're only allowed to provide it together with your services. And then the end client just pays for his service and receives, I would say, either no license, you can say no licenses or licenses included with the service. They don't get licenses. Licenses are still with the provider. And CSP hosting is fundamentally different. And there's a massive confusion in CSP hosting when Microsoft says license included services. So allow me to explain. When a client brings their own license, like in flexible virtualization benefit, that is pretty straightforward. That is clear. That's easy to understand. They bring their own license and they host them with you. You may still do that as a CSP hoster or as a non-CSP hoster. Doesn't matter. Any provider can do that. It's pretty straightforward. It doesn't require an explanation. However, when a license is included, as Microsoft calls it, with the CSP hoster service, First of all, it's completely different from SPLA. It is, in fact, although it's called included, it's not. It is, in fact, a regular CSP transaction. So the client comes to you and wants to rent virtual machines with CSP licenses. They still sign an MCA if they haven't got it yet. A license is still sold to the client when they start renting the virtual machine, and it's still added to their CSP tenant. It's their license. And therefore, what a CSP hosted program calls license included service should be called probably license bundled service or license. The license included name is just misleading. From the end client point of view, there are a few differences between SPLA and license included CSP hosting services. Firstly, in SPLA, there is no license transaction versus a regular license purchase from a CSP hoster with the license included services. Secondly, and that may be important for many, it really depends on your business model. It really depends on what clients you're working with. The minimal term in SPLA is a calendar month. That's it, that's the billing term. Versus at least 1 year in CSP. There are no monthly subscriptions for server licenses, sorry. Again, I'm not saying that CSP hosting offerings are worse than SPLA, but these differences must be understood. If an end client is okay with having to manage their own licenses, if they're okay with a minimal subscription term of a year, and if your typical end client stays with you for at least a year or 3, we've been working with providers where CSP hosting makes so much sense because they work with, say, government institutions and their minimal contract length is 3 years. It makes a lot of sense. And in that case, CSP hosting can provide cost benefits to the end client and business benefits to the provider. So again, assess it. Does it work for you? Plus, of course, Microsoft rewards CSP sales. I already said about it multiple times. If you're not just an infrastructure provider, but you're also an active CSP partner, I really don't have to explain it to you. You already know that. But if your clients come and go often and require temporary or elastic workloads, SPLA is more flexible. And it's usually more commercially reasonable for the clients for obvious reasons. I don't need a license for a year if I only need to run a virtual machine for 2 or 3 months, or I don't even know, will this particular project survive longer? I want my monthly billing. I possibly want my SQL with Azure Arc on an hourly billing. That's another option. From the commercial perspective, from the point of view of making money, we need to talk about the most important difference in licensing models. You need to understand it and possibly re-architect your infrastructure, not only to achieve better bottom line, but also to potentially avoid financial losses. What is it? It relates to Windows Server. It relates to Windows Server. In SPLA, Windows Server is usually licensed in the simplest of all ways. You just assign the necessary Windows Server data center licenses to the hosts in your infrastructure, and then you run as many virtual machines as you want and share the costs of the licenses between all Windows Server virtual machines running on the host. That's why, by the way, going a bit on the tangent, we always say isolate Windows Server virtual machines from Linuxes, Windows clients, because then the relative cost of license per virtual machine is lower and you make better profits. So that is SPLA. There is no limit. If you use Windows Server data set licenses, there is no limit on the number of virtual machines, and then your profitability depends on the density of Windows Server virtual machines per host. Should be simple. It's not a difficult concept to grasp. In CSP hosting, on the other hand, and flexible virtualization benefit, we're talking about Windows Server. You will most probably license end client machines per virtual machine, and that option is unavailable in SPLA. It's not available for SPLA providers. It causes confusions. It's not a very frequently asked questions, but I answer the question probably once in every 2 weeks, every fortnight. So these are 2 completely different licensing models, and more importantly, they're different commercial models when you calculate the cost of the license, when you calculate the cost of the infrastructure. And that is why you should never mix them on the same hardware. If you mix, by all means, you can do if you want. But if you mix SPLA and non-SPLA licensed Windows Server instances, your relative SPLA cost per virtual machine will increase. You dilute that profit because you can't really run unlimited number of virtual machines. There's a limit imposed by the hardware, imposed by performance considerations. And it's in your interest to keep SPLA licensed Windows Server virtual machines in one basket and have another basket for bring your own license Windows Server. So if you want to allow your own clients to bring their Windows Server licenses, or you want to include them as a CSP hoster, build a dedicated infrastructure for that. Do not mix SPLA and bring your own license Windows Server licenses on the same hardware. Not as critical, but there's another confusion with client access licenses for Windows Server. So those of you who have been for a very long time in SPLA, SPLA only requires client access licenses for remote desktop and very rarely used rights management services. There's no traditional Windows Server CAL, it's not required. However, when the client brings their own Windows Server license, they must also ensure they have the basic Windows Server CALs. It doesn't matter if a provider is a CSP hoster or not. When they bring the license, they need to bring their CALs. Complicated enough, isn't it? Now, when a client rents a Windows Server license included virtual machine from a CSP hoster, only from a CSP hoster, then again, the basic Windows Server CALs are not required, like in SPLA. So it is clearly, when CSP hoster benefit, the question is it really mission critical? And I wish I knew who came up with this brilliant ideas and this mix in Microsoft. It's already complicated enough. So just remember, I'll try and simplify this, and please bear with me. Just remember that in any bring your own license scenario for Windows Server, when an end client uses their own licenses, not included by CSP hoster, not via SPLA, they need to have Windows Server CALs. If you are the CSP partner, not a CSP hoster, please ensure they have the necessary Windows Server CALs and potentially make money on it. And I'll repeat that most of the time, you don't need to be a CSP hoster, and you can still benefit from the flexible virtualization benefits, additional flexibility. I keep repeating the word flexibility and benefits. Sorry for that. And the opportunity to resell CSP licenses to your hosted clients. The barrier to becoming a CSP hoster is still relatively high. Microsoft promised, when they introduced the program 3 years ago, they promised to make it simpler. They haven't yet. You still must be a tier 1 CSP. So if you're not a tier 1 CSP and you don't want to become a tier 1 CSP, just consider allowing your clients to use the flexible virtualization benefit. It's almost the same. It's almost the same with the differences we've discussed, but let me reiterate the most critical ones. Again, I'm just repeating myself now. You won't be allowed to activate the virtual machines, but the only friction point is that the end client will have to activate them, or you may use their keys. And you may still sell them CSP subscription licenses together with the virtual machines, but Windows Server CALs will be required for Windows Server. So these are the two differences between CSP hosting and just flexible virtualization benefit. And if you're not a CSP hoster, there are no reporting requirements. On that note, however, as one of our core services is audit defense, we see in audits of all kinds and shapes. Or we sign a new provider client almost every week. We strongly suggest track and bring your own license internally anyway. Find out how, develop a process. You want us to give you some templates, ideas of how to develop such a process, reach out to me, read articles on our website. Again, I don't bite, so just come and ask your questions. And you will thank us for this advice. And I'm not exaggerating when you get an audit letter from Microsoft, because BYOL, bring your own license, needs evidence. You need that evidence. Otherwise, it'll be just counted as your SPLA debt to Microsoft. Do you want that? Probably not. Let's talk a bit about the economics of CSP hosting, SPLA, and the flexible virtualization benefit. So there are always two sides to that. The end client cost and the profitability for the service provider. We need to consider them both. They're connected by the ability to offering compelling and competitive services. I hope I'm not opening a universe for you. You understand that. So when you provide more options, you may attract more clients. When you reduce your internal costs, you may either increase your profits or decrease the cost of the service to the client and be more competitive. Lots of very simple mechanisms that you should know from, I wouldn't say from school, but from when you were in the uni, maybe. And for the end client, bringing their existing licenses via software assurance or a subscription, or especially licenses with software assurance, that they may have inherited via legacy enterprise agreements, which are now being phased out, but still there. Those subscriptions, where they pay for just software assurance, is almost always cheaper than SPLA. It's almost always cheaper than license-included options in CSP hosting. It's almost always cheaper, as it stands right now, than SQL Server with Azure Arc. So it's a potential competitive advantage when you offer them a bring your own license, considering the whole offering of hosted services, backups, and whatnot, plus licenses. And if there's a tender on price, you have an additional ace up your sleeve. And again, for the end client, when they only need a few virtual machines, it may be cheaper to buy CSP licenses from you together with the virtual machines compared to the cost of SPLA. That's another consideration. Why not? Especially if they're long-term clients. And the cost benefits here heavily depend on your cloud infrastructure. Number of hosts and cores, density of virtual machines, isolation of Windows Server virtual machines for SPLA. I already mentioned that. And there are other factors affecting the relative cost of a virtual machine. So that is what you're targeting. That's what you're researching. And that's what we can help you research. This accurate commercial feasibility study actually is not rocket science. It's not too difficult as long as you know what you're doing. So we always suggest calculating and planning first and executing after. Don't just jump into FVB. Don't just jump into CSP hosting. Don't just jump into SQL with Azure Arc, although the latter, SQL Server with Azure Arc, doesn't require massive considerations from the commercial point of view. It's not rocket science. Calculate, plan first, execute after, and we can help you with that. And the bottom line to what I'm talking about today is that SPLA, SQL Server with Azure Arc, and CSP hosting, or just bring your own license if you don't want to become a CSP host, they can coexist if you want to. And with good commercial and architectural planning, a mix of this can provide benefits both to you and your end clients. We have comparison white papers between different licensing programs. Please email us at ask@SAMexpert.com. It's ASK Alpha Sierra Kilo @SAMexpert.com. And yeah, I'll share them with you. And on this note, unless you have any questions, specific questions for me today, I wish you a productive week and all the best in your service provider business. Take care.